My name's Sam, and a few months ago, I got myself into a mess I wouldn't wish on anyone. It started because I thought I could make some fast cash playing poker with guys who'd been doing it a lot longer than me. I wasn't a total amateur, but I wasn't smart about knowing when to stop. Long story short, I ended up owing a lot of money to some people you don't want to owe anything to. They weren't patient either. I had about a week to figure out how to pay them back before things got bad, real bad. That's when I saw the ad. It wasn't flashy or anything, just a plain listing in the classifieds. Night watchman needed, warehouse facility, good pay, no experience necessary. I didn't think twice. I called the number, spoke to someone who called himself Mr. Keller, and by the next day I had the job. It wasn't ideal, but hey, desperate times, right? The warehouse was on the edge of town, one of those massive, almost abandoned-looking places. It smelled like old wood and metal, with rows and rows of shelves that stretched toward the ceiling, filled with pallets of, well, I didn't know. No one ever told me what exactly the company stored here, and honestly, I didn't care. Mr. Keller was the one who walked me through my duties. He was tall, thin, and had this air about him, like he didn't care much for small talk. We barely exchanged names before he got straight to business. He handed me a laminated sheet of rules and went over each one like it was life or death. "Follow these and you'll be fine," he said in this calm, clipped tone. "Mess up even once and—" He didn't finish the sentence, just gave me this look that sent a chill down my spine. The rules weren't anything I'd heard before for a job like this. Never shine your flashlight into the rafters after midnight. That one was weird, but Keller didn't elaborate. He just said, "Trust me, you don't want to know." There were 5 other rules just as strange. One was about the loading dock light, another about walking counterclockwise during rounds, something about a doorbell too. It all sounded like a joke, but Keller wasn't the type to kid around. "Think of it as part of the job," he said, handing me the keys. "Keep your head down, follow the rules, and we won't have a problem." I nodded, took the keys, and clocked in for my first shift. At first, it felt exactly how I thought it'd be, boring. Hours stretched on as I wandered through the aisles, the air cool and still. Occasionally, I'd hear a distant creak or the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Nothing creepy, just the sounds of an old building settling. But then, just past midnight, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, not yet. Just this sense that the air had changed, heavier somehow, like the place was holding its breath. I shook it off, figuring I was just tired or imagining things. I made my rounds, walking along the outer perimeter of the warehouse, keeping an eye on the shadows stretching across the floor. The aisles looked endless in the dim light, like they could go on forever. At one point, I thought I heard a faint thud above me, but when I looked up, there was nothing. I didn't shine my flashlight, though. I wasn't about to break the first rule on my first night. The rest of the shift passed without incident, but that feeling of being watched, it never left. By the time dawn broke and my shift ended, I was more than ready to get out of there. As I left, Keller was waiting by the door. "How was it?" he asked. "Uneventful," I said, forcing a grin. He nodded but didn't say anything else. Just handed me an envelope with my pay and told me to be back by 10 p.m. I drove home, pocketed the cash, and told myself it'd be fine. Just a few weeks, I thought. Just long enough to pay off the debt and get out. I didn't know then how wrong I was. The second night started the same way. Keller was there when I arrived, his usual stern self, handing me the keys and reminding me, "Stick to the rules." I nodded, thinking I had it all figured out. But something about his tone felt heavier that night, like he knew something I didn't. The first few hours were routine. I walked my rounds, checked the loading dock, and kept an eye on the shelves. There was this weird comfort in the monotony of it. Like as long as I stayed busy, nothing could sneak up on me. Around midnight, I was walking near the loading dock when the overhead light started to flicker. It wasn't a gentle flicker either. It was sharp, erratic, like the bulb was fighting to stay on. I stopped in my tracks, my pulse quickening as I stared at it. That's when the second rule came to mind. If the loading dock light flickers, turn it off immediately. I didn't hesitate. Reaching for the nearby switch, I flipped it off, plunging the area into darkness. The sudden silence that followed was deafening. like the warehouse itself was holding its breath. I waited a few moments before turning my flashlight back on, sweeping it over the dock. Everything looked the same as before. Stacks of crates, a few stray pallets, but something didn't feel right. The shadows seemed deeper, stretched at strange angles that didn't make sense. I forced myself to move, to keep walking, telling myself it was just my imagination. But as I turned to head back toward the main floor, I heard something. A faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across metal. It was coming from somewhere above me. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I stared at the rafters. I didn't point the beam up. The first rule echoed in my head, loud and clear. Instead, I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence, before forcing myself to continue my rounds. The rest of the shift was tense. Every creak, every shadow felt like it was watching me. I kept to the perimeter, my flashlight low, and did my best to avoid looking up. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted, physically and mentally. Keller was waiting for me again when I clocked out. He didn't say much, just looked at me with that same unreadable expression. "See you tomorrow," he said, his voice flat. I nodded and left, but the unease followed me home. I tried to shake it off, to convince myself it was just the stress of the job, but deep down I knew better. Something was wrong with that place. I just didn't know how bad it was yet. By the third night, I was starting to feel like I was settling into a routine. The rules didn't seem that complicated, at least on paper, and as long as I followed them, nothing too strange happened. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. Keller was waiting by the time I got there, as usual. This time, though, he didn't just hand me the keys and leave. He lingered, watching me for a moment, like he was trying to decide whether or not to say something. "Everything okay last night?" he finally asked. "Yeah," I lied. I wasn't about to admit how rattled I'd been. He nodded, but his expression didn't change. "Good. Keep it that way." With that, he left, and I was on my own again. The first few hours passed quietly. I did my rounds, keeping to the counterclockwise route as the rules required. I wasn't entirely sure why the third rule mattered so much. Always walk counterclockwise. Walking the other way will get their attention. Who were they, and what kind of attention were we talking about? But I wasn't curious enough to test it. By the time midnight rolled around, I was back near the abandoned section of the warehouse. I hated this part of the rounds the most. Even though the area was sealed off, it felt like it was watching me somehow. The air was colder here, and no matter how many times I walked past it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was just on the other side of that locked door. I quickened my pace, trying not to linger, but halfway down the aisle, the temperature dropped. It wasn't a subtle change either. It was sudden, biting, like stepping into a freezer. The fourth rule flashed in my mind. When the temperature suddenly drops, count to 5. If it doesn't return to normal, leave the floor immediately. I stopped in my tracks, my breath visible in the frigid air, and started counting under my breath. 1, 2, 3. The cold didn't budge. If anything, it got worse, the kind of cold that made your bones ache. 4, 5. Still freezing. I didn't wait for whatever came next. Turning on my heel, I bolted toward the stairs, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I ran. I didn't stop until I was back on the main floor, where the temperature was blessedly normal. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath and trying to calm the hammering in my chest. But as I looked around, I noticed something strange. The shadows near the far wall seemed to ripple, like they were moving, even though nothing else was. I stared at them, frozen in place until they stopped. Everything went still again, like nothing had happened. The rest of the night was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me back up from that cold, dark corner of the warehouse. By the time I showed up for my fourth shift, the anxiety was starting to take its toll. My hands trembled as I took the keys from Keller, who didn't even bother asking if I was okay this time. "You'll get used to it," he said instead, his voice flat. I wanted to tell him I wouldn't, that I was already thinking about quitting and finding another way to deal with my debts. But I kept my mouth shut. The night started off normal enough. I made my rounds, keeping to the counterclockwise route, and avoided the abandoned section entirely. Everything felt quiet, too quiet. Around 1 a.m., I was near the loading dock when I heard something that made my skin crawl. A doorbell. It was faint but unmistakable, echoing through the vast empty warehouse. I froze, gripping my flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else here. The sixth rule came back to me in a flash. If you hear a doorbell and no one's there, don't look outside. For a moment, I stood there debating whether or not to check. What if it was just a delivery? Or maybe one of the other employees coming in late for some reason? But the rule was clear, and Keller's warning rang in my ears. Mess up even once. I stayed put, not daring to move closer to the loading dock doors. The bell rang again, louder this time, and I swore I could feel the sound vibrating in my chest. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with the kind of tension that made every hair on my body stand on end. I waited, counting the seconds, until I was sure the sound wasn't coming back. When I finally forced myself to continue my rounds, I noticed something strange. The shadows on the floor seemed wrong, like they weren't connected to anything, just floating there, dark and shapeless. I avoided them as best as I could, sticking to the lit areas and keeping my flashlight trained on the ground in front of me. But no matter how careful I was, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. The rest of the night was a blur. By the time my shift ended, I felt like I'd aged 10 years. Keller didn't say a word when I handed him the keys, just gave me a knowing look before I left. I drove home in silence, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. What the hell was going on in that warehouse? And how much worse could it get? The fifth night felt different before I even stepped foot in the building. The air outside was heavy, almost suffocating, and the streetlights along the road flickered as I drove toward the warehouse. I'd barely slept after the previous shift, my mind replaying the doorbell sound and the shadowy movements on the floor. As I parked and walked toward the entrance, I noticed Keller wasn't waiting outside this time. The door was unlocked, the keys sitting on the front desk like they'd been tossed there carelessly. "Keller?" I called out, but there was no answer. For a split second, I thought about turning around and leaving. Whatever was going on in this place wasn't worth the money or my sanity. But then I remembered the debt collectors, how close they were to catching up with me, and forced myself inside. The first half of my shift passed without incident. I followed the counterclockwise route, checked the loading dock, and avoided the abandoned section. Everything was quiet, eerily so. It wasn't until I was back near the middle of the warehouse that things started to go wrong. The overhead lights flickered once, then twice. I stopped in my tracks, staring up at them, willing them to stay on, and then they went out. The darkness was immediate, swallowing the room in a way that didn't feel natural. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the pitch blackness in shaky, nervous sweeps. That's when I noticed it. The light above the loading dock was flickering. The second rule hit me like a punch to the gut. If the loading dock light flickers, turn it off immediately. I didn't hesitate. Sprinting toward the switch, I tried to ignore the way the flickering light seemed to pulse in rhythm with my racing heart. When I reached it, I slammed the switch down, plunging the area into complete darkness. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own breathing, and then I heard it, a soft, shuffling noise, like something moving just out of sight. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there. The sound grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was circling me. My pulse hammered as I backed away slowly, keeping the beam of light steady in front of me. The shuffling stopped abruptly, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I thought I saw something. Just a shadow, darting out of sight at the edge of the beam. The rest of the night was a blur of tension and paranoia. Every noise, every creak, set my nerves on edge. By the time my shift ended, I was trembling, barely able to hand Keller the keys before bolting out the door. The sixth night began with dread pooling in my stomach. I didn't want to go back, but I had no choice. The money was too good to pass up, and the consequences of quitting weren't any better than facing whatever waited for me in the warehouse. Keller wasn't there again. This time, though, there was a note on the desk. "Don't look for me. Just follow the rules, K." That didn't help my nerves. I pocketed the note and started my rounds, the flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. The counterclockwise path felt endless, each step echoing through the cavernous space like a taunt. When I reached the abandoned section, I froze. Something was different. The sealed door looked wrong. The heavy padlock was still in place, but the door itself was slightly ajar, just enough to create a thin sliver of blackness that seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. The fifth rule screamed in my head: never walk past the abandoned section of the warehouse at night. It's sealed for a reason. I knew better than to get close. Backing away slowly, I kept my eyes on the door until I was far enough down the aisle that it disappeared from sight. But as I continued my rounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run, to get out of there. Instead, I kept walking, forcing myself to stick to the route. It wasn't until I reached the far side of the warehouse that I saw it, something moving in the shadows near the ceiling. It was faint, barely visible, but it was there. I stopped, my heart pounding so loudly it felt like it would burst. The flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam flickering slightly as I aimed it upward. I didn't shine it directly at the rafters. The first rule stayed firmly in my mind: never shine your flashlight into the rafters after midnight. Whatever was up there didn't seem to notice me. It shifted slightly, then disappeared into the darkness, leaving me standing there, frozen in fear. The rest of the night passed in a haze of terror and exhaustion. By the time the sun started to rise, I was practically running for the exit, desperate to escape the suffocating darkness of the warehouse. Keller was nowhere to be found when I left, and I didn't care. All I wanted was to go home and forget the nightmare I just endured. But as I drove away, a single thought gnawed at the edges of my mind. What would happen if the door to the abandoned section wasn't sealed next time? The seventh night wasn't like the others. I had spent the entire day pacing my small apartment, debating whether to go back. The note Keller left haunted me. Don't look for me. Just follow the rules. It sounded less like advice and more like a warning. But the thought of the unpaid debt clawing at my heels left me with no real choice. When I arrived, the warehouse looked emptier than usual, if that was even possible. The distant hum of machinery was gone, replaced by a silence so oppressive that my own breathing felt loud. There was no sign of Keller again, but the keys were in their usual spot. This time, though, they were accompanied by something else, a black envelope, sealed with red wax. My fingers trembled as I opened it, pulling out a piece of thick, yellowed paper. In bold, shaky handwriting, it said, "Stay on your path. Don't trust the shadows." I stuffed the note in my pocket, trying to shake off the unease. I started my rounds, following the counterclockwise route as always. At first, everything seemed normal, or as normal as this place ever got. But as I turned a corner near the middle of the warehouse, the temperature dropped so suddenly that I stumbled back. I froze, counting under my breath. 1, 2, 3. By the time I reached 5, the icy chill still lingered in the air. The fourth rule echoed in my mind. When the temperature suddenly drops, count to 5. If it doesn't return to normal, leave the floor immediately. I didn't wait. Turning on my heel, I hurried back the way I came, my flashlight swinging wildly as I scanned the shadows. The cold followed me, creeping along my skin like invisible fingers. My breath misted in front of me, each exhale shaky and uneven. When I reached the staircase leading to the next floor, the chill vanished as abruptly as it had arrived. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, before continuing my rounds. But the rest of the night didn't offer any reprieve. The shadows seemed alive, shifting in ways that didn't match the movements of my flashlight. I kept to the path, refusing to deviate, no matter how much the dark seemed to beckon. By the time my shift ended, I felt like I'd been holding my breath for hours. I handed the keys to the desk, glancing around one last time for any sign of Keller. He was still nowhere to be found. As I walked to my car, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. The eighth night started with dread settling heavy in my chest. I was running out of reasons to convince myself to keep showing up, but the thought of what waited for me outside this job was worse. When I walked into the warehouse, the air felt different, thicker, heavier, almost like it was pressing down on me. The shadows seemed darker, more pronounced, and the silence was deafening. The keys were on the desk as usual, but this time, the black envelope was gone. In its place was a small stack of papers, old and crumbling at the edges. Curiosity got the better of me, and I flipped through them. Most of it was unreadable, faded symbols and smudged writing that didn't make any sense. But one page stood out. It was a diagram of the warehouse rafters, covered in strange markings that looked like they'd been drawn in haste. I stuffed the papers in my pocket, feeling a chill run down my spine. Whatever Keller had been doing here before he vanished, it was bigger than I wanted to know. I started my rounds, sticking to the counterclockwise route like my life depended on it. Each step felt heavier, the shadows closer, more oppressive. When I passed the loading dock, I noticed something strange. The door leading to the dock was slightly ajar, swinging gently as if someone had just passed through. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, to stick to the path and follow the rules. But then I heard it, a faint noise, like the sound of footsteps echoing from the direction of the abandoned section. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my palms slick with sweat. The fifth rule burned in my mind. Never walk past the abandoned section of the warehouse at night. It's sealed for a reason. I turned away from the noise, forcing myself to stay on the path. But the sound didn't stop. It followed me, faint and distant at first, then growing louder, closer. By the time I reached the far side of the warehouse, I was almost running. The sound of footsteps seemed to come from all directions, surrounding me in a way that defied logic. I stopped, leaning against a metal shelf to catch my breath. The footsteps stopped, too, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. And then I heard it, a faint, whispering voice, so quiet I almost thought I imagined it. Leave. I didn't need to be told twice. I finished my rounds as quickly as possible, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally handed the keys back and left the warehouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me from the shadows. The ninth night was different from the start. As soon as I stepped into the warehouse, I felt it, an overwhelming sense of dread, like the air itself was heavier. The shadows seemed thicker, more alive, and every sound echoed unnaturally. The keys were on the desk as usual, but this time there was no envelope, no message, nothing. Just the suffocating silence and the knowledge that Keller was still gone. I hesitated, staring at the keys, wondering if it was worth it. But the debt I owed wasn't the kind of thing you walked away from. I grabbed them and started my rounds, sticking to the counterclockwise path like I always did. The first few minutes were uneventful, but as I turned the corner near the center of the warehouse, the flickering started. The loading dock light blinked erratically, casting strange, distorted shadows across the walls. I froze, remembering the second rule. If the loading dock light flickers, turn it off immediately. My hand trembled as I approached the switch, the light stuttering above me like it was fighting to stay alive. I reached out, flipped it off, and the warehouse plunged into darkness. For a moment there was silence, oppressive and all-encompassing. And then, from the direction of the rafters, I heard it, faint creaking, like something shifting above me. I kept my flashlight low, aiming it at the ground, not daring to break the first rule. My breathing quickened as the creaking turned into something else, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like nails dragging across wood. I forced myself to move, staying on the path, my flashlight illuminating only what was directly in front of me. The tapping followed me, growing louder, closer, until it sounded like it was right above me. I stopped, my heart pounding. The urge to look up was almost unbearable, but I clenched my jaw and kept walking. The rest of the night was a blur of shadows and sounds that didn't make sense. By the time my shift ended, I felt like I'd been running a marathon. I handed the keys back without a word and bolted for my car, the feeling of being watched stronger than ever. The final night started with a storm. Lightning lit up the sky as I drove to the warehouse, the rain hammering against my windshield like it wanted to keep me away. I almost turned back. Almost. But when I stepped into the warehouse, I knew something was wrong. The air was colder than usual, the silence deeper. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, like they were waiting for me. I grabbed the keys and started my rounds, my flashlight flickering as if the battery was dying. Every step felt heavier, the weight of the previous nights pressing down on me. When I reached the center of the warehouse, the temperature dropped sharply, and I began to count under my breath. 1, 2, 3. By the time I reached 5, the cold hadn't gone away. I turned to leave the floor, but that's when I saw it, a faint glow coming from the abandoned section of the warehouse. I froze. The fifth rule repeated in my mind: never walk past the abandoned section of the warehouse at night. It's sealed for a reason. I should have turned away. I should have ignored it. But something about the light drew me in. Against every instinct, I took a step toward the section, my flashlight aimed at the floor. The glow pulsed, brightening and dimming like a heartbeat. As I got closer, I noticed the markings on the walls, symbols I'd seen before on the papers Keller left behind. And then, from above, I heard it. Faint footsteps, moving slowly across the rafters. I stopped, my heart racing. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were directly overhead. I couldn't take it anymore. My hand moved on its own, raising the flashlight and shining it into the rafters. At first, there was nothing, just empty beams and the strange markings carved into the wood. But then I saw it, fresh scratches, wood splintered and broken as if something had clawed at it. The markings seemed to glow faintly, pulsing like the light from the abandoned section. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow, shifting unnaturally, darted across the rafters. My flashlight flickered, and the temperature dropped even further. That's when the whispers started, soft, unintelligible but growing louder, surrounding me. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The glow from the abandoned section flared, illuminating the warehouse in an eerie, otherworldly light. Suddenly, the whispers coalesced into a single, chilling word: blood. The papers Keller left flashed in my mind, the diagrams, the symbols. I remembered the ritual, the blood smeared on the markings. My hands shook as I pulled out my pocket knife, the blade glinting in the unnatural light. I hesitated, the weight of what I was about to do sinking in, but the shadows were closing in, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. I pressed the blade to my palm and made a shallow cut, the pain sharp and immediate. Blood welled up, dripping onto the floor. I smeared it onto the nearest marking, the glow intensifying as the blood soaked into the wood. The shadows stopped, the whispers fell silent. The warehouse was still. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran, leaving the flashlight behind, not stopping until I was in my car. I quit the job the next morning. Whatever Keller had gotten himself into, I wanted no part of it. But even now, I can't escape the feeling that something followed me. The shadows in my apartment seem darker, the whispers louder when the lights go out, and sometimes in the dead of night, I swear I hear footsteps above me. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for daily horror stories that get creepier every night.